Joining me now is a bit of a unicorn in the world of politics. Maria Comella, I first met when she did work largely for Republican candidates. She has since worked for her share of Democratic candidates. And it doesn't mean she may not work for somebody from either side of the aisle, but I think the best way to describe her is probably as a constitutionalist, which these days I feel like is its own separate and distinct category, given what we're watching with the extremes of both parties trying to basically run around with ends justifies the means mindsets these days. I've known Maria, I want to say, is it 25 years, Maria?
I think so. I feel like we were both much younger.
Yes.
It was the aughts. It was the early aughts, I think.
It was the early aughts. I think you've aged better than me. So I'm the one losing my hair and graying. So you've got a couple of advantages there. I'd say you've got better genes, but I don't know. That might that's the wrong phrase these days. Yeah, I can't say that. Yeah. But one of the impetuses for this conversation were some memos that you wrote. You did work on behalf of the Kamala Harris campaign. And actually, before we get to the memos that you wrote that were part of one of the What Happened in 2024 books, I say one of, because there's like 3 or 4 already. Yeah. And I think a couple more that are coming. And so you've shared all of these memos with me. And frankly, and I want to get to it, the memos read to me like they're very relevant right now, right? What the issues that the Democratic Party and Kamala Harris were dealing with in August, September, and October, arguably are the same issues today. So I think it's a very relevant conversation. But I think it's interesting. I just shortchanged your journey. Give folks the 5-minute origin story of Maria Comella.
Oh gosh, the origin story. I think, and this might explain why I've been able to work on both sides of the aisle. I think from the get-go, maybe I've been a little naive, but I got into politics and wanted to work in government because I believed in the Constitution. There were certain things that I grew up with, like my parents were always talking about history at the dinner table. They were talking about politics.
Where did you grow up, Maria?
I grew up upstate New York, outside Albany.
Okay. Gotcha.
And I was, first of both, generations of both my mom and dad's side to go to college. And, it was, so I was raised in a way that I think it just was sort of a lover of like what, all the possibility of this country could be. And I saw that with my parents. And I also saw how, and my dad always gives me a hard time for talking about this, but he was someone who also voted on both sides of the aisle over the years, right? So he was guided by certain things he believed in. And, as we've kind of all come to see, the parties shift, they change, they're dynamic, they, aren't consistent in terms of the principles that define them. And I have found that to be the case with myself on a personal level. But I went to school in DC and went to college because for that reason, I wanted to be in Washington, interned on the Hill, kind of started
I know
out.
that pattern. I picked a DC school for that same thing. I
know, it's like where to be.
Right.
And then, ended up doing political campaigns and kind of got the bug. And once you get the bug, it's hard to shake it, right? Because it just feels like the be all and end all. And, I started out in Republican politics. My first campaign was actually working for Governor George Pataki on his third reelect here in New York, which was again sort of
202.
Oh yeah, 02.
Yeah,
so
202.
A year after 9/11, his third term. I think kind of instructive, right? A Republican who was able, to win support from, constituencies and coalitions you wouldn't expect from a Republican. And, went on and did the Bush campaign in 2004 in New Hampshire, and then went to Iowa and did a governor's race there for a member of Congress. And it was, 2006, sort of bad year. And for Republicans.
That Jim Nussle?
It is Jim Nussle. I have your good
Well,
memory.
I'm actually doing a project with Karen Nussle.
Oh my God, I love Karen and
she's
Jim.
Terrific. I mean, it's a great cause. Actually, we're trying to build a coalition. It's called Trust in Media, but it's really bigger than that. She's working with, just a quick aside, a bunch of sort of former diplomats, State Department, intel officers, and if we don't have trusted information, right, it doesn't matter whether you think something's biased or not. It's about, is it truthful or not, right? And we have the intelligence agencies, right? They need trusted information. And if we don't have it, That's how sort of societies crumble and stuff. And it's a great group because it's not just the pearl clutchers of the left about local, about news, right? This is about the information ecosystem, which to me is a bit of a bigger conversation. Anyway,
Yeah.
I
And a
just
challenge.
adore
Yeah.
Karen Nussel, and I've always been, going back to the paper bag with my friend Jim Nussel.
Yeah.
And John
Well,
Kasich always says, it was Jim that put the paper bag on. I didn't put the paper bag
that
on.
is true. It was Jim. But, and he was like a great, I mean, it was interesting when I think back to that time because he was, from the eastern part of Iowa. His district was
Mhm.
not predominantly Republican, so he had to win
Very swingy
independents.
district. Yeah, very
Yeah.
union heavy. Right. Very swingy. Still
And
swinging. I mean, the area is
yeah.
still a swing area. Yeah.
Yeah, and he, had a way, right, that he had to, which I think is like prescient when we think about, I think the Harris campaign and certainly folks today, is he actually had to earn votes from people who weren't inclined to support him just based on his party identity. And it was interesting because '06 was sort of like that first year after, the Bush reelect in '04, the Rove strategy, right?
Right.
Drive out the base. And
Yeah.
so kind of every operative of that era really was kind of doubled down from a strategic perspective. And, that age old, let's like run the race from the last time versus,
Yeah, it
this one
didn't
is
work. Yeah.
obviously different. And I watched him, sort of kind of struggle with that dynamic. And I think,
He had a terrible first name, Congressman. You know what I mean?
yeah,
In
well,
a
that too.
year
Yeah. It
that's what I
was,
always say. It's like when
yeah.
it's always tough when you're an incumbent member, when you're from Washington running for an office not of Washington, and Washington is super unpopular in that moment, which in that moment it was, right? More so than usual type of moment. Sometimes you just can't get out from under the name
Yeah.
Congressman. Yeah.
Yeah. I think that's true. I also think for me, it was, it was instructive because it was sort of seeing what happens when you aren't necessarily true to your principles. And I'm,
Mhm.
obviously I understand that from political perspective. There are times where it's like not worth the fight, or you need to do what you kind of need to do. But I think it was the first in sort of, I think, a series of folks that I started working for where I saw saw them move away from what was their brand or their core,
Mhm.
and it ultimately not working out.
Right.
And I saw that particularly, going from Jim's race, and I went on to the presidential in '08 and worked for Mayor Giuliani of a different era, Mayor Giuliani.
Yeah.
But I went to work for him in part because he was kind of like, "This is who I am, and I'm this pro-choice Republican,"
Right.
and was just very clear and definitive. And even when we got into that race, saw, you know, s- saw saw him sort of get squeamish and look to kind of
Mhm.
appeal to certain constituencies. And, as soon as you kind of start doing that, you kind of move away from who you are. And
The
ultimately, it's
tyranny
never
of
enough
primary
anyway.
poli Yeah, it's
I
the
know.
primary politics trap, right? Like, I think about it today with the Democratic Party, right? The base wants a fighter, swing voters want an adult in the room, and the two don't go
Yeah.
hand in hand right now, you
Yeah.
know?
No,
I
no.
it's
And they
it's a real
potentially
challenge.
could meet somewhere, but yeah,
I think
but
they
not now.
kinda did, and I
Yeah.
think that was what they thought. I think there was a belief that Biden could do that,
Could
and
do
it
it.
turned out he could not, right?
Yeah.
Like, it was
Yeah.
just an utter failure. We'll keep the journey going. So you're on
Yeah.
Rudy.
Yeah.
Yeah,
On
and then
Rudy.
yeah.
Which honestly was a really unbelievable experience and is the reason, I moved to New York and, haven't left since. So, I'm grateful for that. And it was a real training ground, that race
Oh,
and
yeah.
dealing with the New York press corps of an era, that's when Maggie Haberman was at the New York Post. So, it was like you kind of you earned your stripes on that race and it was a
Running
totally
let
different
me let
beast.
me running for president is already right, Axelrod has that great quote, "An MRI from the soul." When you throw in the interest of the New York tabloids, right?
Yeah.
That's just this added extra layer that no other campaign had to deal with,
Yeah.
right? And there's a reason why New Yorkers, I mean, which is why I think so many of us wrote off Trump because there was no way you could survive the New York tabloids unless
Right.
you're Donald Trump. It turns out,
Right.
but anyway,
Yeah.
but
Yeah.
but but I digress. Keep going.
So yeah, did Rudy then ended up doing the last couple of months of the McCain campaign and from there, thought I was kind of done with politics at like the ripe old age of like 28 and was kind of like this is what I thought it was going to be.
Yeah.
And ended up getting approached to go work on this New Jersey governor's race. I remember friends that I had worked with on, if you know Mike Duhame, who I had
Hmm.
worked with on Bush, but then ultimately worked on Rudy and then McCain. He was really the reason I was at McCain. Called me and it was like, I've got this race. We really need a comms person. And I was like, Mike, I love you, like, but I'm not about to go do my like third losing race in a row with you. Because at the time, like, I was like a New Jersey Republican for governor. You got to be kidding me. So
Right, right.
but as like the story goes, I did end up meeting with, Chris Christie at the time, was pretty reluctant because I think I was pretty burned out, but ended up kind of getting slowly, roped in. And, next thing you know, he wins. And so ended up, spending the next 6 years in government, working for the state, did his presidential in 15, 16. And then, took some much deserved time off before I, decided I wasn't done with politics yet and went to go work for Governor Cuomo as his chief of staff. And then fully got politics out of my system, at least, for the time being. So I
I
moved to
love
the
this.
private sector.
You keep saying you get politics out of your system, and what
I
happens?
know.
You get sucked back
I'm gonna
in. You
s-
win.
I'm gonna
You
say it
know,
now too. I'm like, I'm totally done, Chuck.
yeah.
Totally.
Of course you are. And then how'd you get to the Kamala Harris campaign?
I started my own firm about 2 years ago after doing a couple stints in the private sector,
Hmm.
and we're a small firm, but we all kind of took, we took, I want to say we took a pause really to do Christie's last presidential race because it was like very personal,
Hmm.
and it just kind of felt like the right thing to do considering how he wanted to do it. And so kind of coming off of that when I was kind of, sort of restarting the business, and I think just actively engaged in conversations and caring about what was going to happen with the cycle. They reached out, so that's how that started. And the conversation started probably like early summer. So when Biden was still the nominee, so that's actually when the
Hmm.
conversation started, and then obviously got put on pause until
Right,
once the debate happened, and then came back
right.
around once they had Harris locked in. So
I could say there's an interesting through line for you, because Cuomo, Rudy, and Christie more in common than they are more alike than unalike. Yes or no?
well, I would say this is what they have in common, and I always joke with people, and I have a very specific niche, which is Sicilian farmer prosecutors, and so, like
Love this. It's true.
so which is probably something I should work out in therapy,
I mean,
instead
there's
of being
got to
totally
be a
honest
TV
about
show.
yeah.
This has got to be forget. This is like this is its own White Lotus. I mean, you literally go from like island to island, and you're like, wait a minute, the story's the same, the
I know,
personality's the
yeah.
same. What's going on?
Now, I will say, I think people do think because of that, that they are similar. And while there's, I think because of the Italian thing, the prosecuting, there's certainly an element of personality that can be slightly
Sure.
similar. They actually all are very different people,
Mhm.
and working with them from a stylistic perspective, radically different, which I think does surprise people
Of the
because
three? Who's the biggest reader? Who's the one that's like it's hard to keep up with because they're probably reading more than you are.
I would think Chris Christie was like a close, like Giuliani at that point in time when I worked
Hmm.
for him in '07, '08 was a voracious reader as well. So
Interesting.
they have that in common. To the point where like this Rudy was like this in '07, '08. You couldn't put out a statement on like a Supreme Court ruling until he had read it, right? So he was
Interesting.
yeah, and Christie has shades of that, and uh, Christie reads, yeah, voraciously. He's reading like multiple books at any given
Yeah.
time, so
Yeah.
he's usually ahead of the clips before you are. So
And of the three, who's the most self-aware of what the public thinks of them at any given time? Like who truly understood? Look, we all have an image of what we believe we are, and then there's the image of what, Americans see of you, right? Type of mindset, right? Whether you're a politician or any sort of public figure. Of the three, who had the most self-awareness?
Governor Christie,
Yeah. It would have
yeah,
been my guess of the three,
yeah,
right? Yeah,
yeah.
that it
Just
would be.
and I think and I don't know if that's yeah, I think it's specific to him. I don't know if it's also maybe generational, but he always had an ability, even going back to sort of question, um, what he just to question, right? And to look back and be reflective and what could I have done differently. And I think honestly, and I say this because our relationship has changed over time, and it's as could be started out at such a point where I was younger and sort of employee boss, and it's just evolved as I've gotten older and things have
Right.
changed. But I think particularly in the last 10 years, he has so much so that I think when we did this last race together, I was proud to call him a friend because he was an actual human being who was unbelievably, I think,
Mhm.
reflective, and willing to take responsibility, frankly, in a way that, particularly in this day and age, when I look at,
Mhm.
politicians and just sort of operatives and all of us and all of our roles in terms of kind of how we've gotten here, I think, takes a lot of self reflection, awareness, and kind of
Yeah.
guts to be able to do that. So,
It's interesting. He got really angry at me over his last interview on Meet the Press in his presidential campaign because it took place the week the United CEO had to resign. And so it might have been an interview without any of those questions. And then the news
yeah,
happened, right?
yeah,
And I've had this before, right? Nancy Pelosi got mad at me because an interview had to change because the news happened, right?
yeah,
And
yeah,
and so I don't take it as personally, but he really, for a long time, has held a grudge. I think some of it had to do with my own personal friendship with Bill Baroni. And so who knows how much that's wrapped up in there. But I have noticed it does seem as if he doesn't get stuck, I
yeah,
guess is the way he doesn't get stuck in the past.
yeah,
Um, I've seen him reach out to some people that
yeah,
I think 10 years ago, I didn't think he would have done that.
yeah. And I think that's, hopefully we're all like growing as
Right.
people, and and hopefully, we're not also all known for like our worst moment, right?
Of
Or the most
course. Right.
challenging thing we've gone through. And
Yeah.
I do think and I look back at my experiences, and particularly working in his administration, it was an unbelievable ride, and
Hmm.
such high highs and low lows. And I think, I know this for myself, so I can only imagine for him. That's a lot to process in a very short period of time. And so yeah, and I think sometimes we underestimate that. I think for probably anyone who's
Yeah.
on the stage in the way they are.
Mm.
Ideally and hopefully they're all human beings. Maybe not
Right.
all of them are, but
Well, I always say
yeah.
this, I take my pulse, right? Because, there's always this thing, you're biased and all this stuff. Well, we're all biased. We're all born,
Yeah.
as I always like to say,
Right.
we're born with original bias.
Yeah.
It's like where you
Yeah.
grew up, who you're born to,
Yeah.
yada, yada, yada.
Yeah.
Like what era you're born into, right? Like, so
Yeah.
all of it is inherent bias. The question is, are you fair? Right?
Yeah.
That's what I've always said when it comes to that. Are you fair? Or for a politician, are you honest?
Yeah. Yeah.
And go from there. So, um, how much do you feel like your advice was taken by the Biden-Harris team at any given time? Did you feel as if you had a seat at the table, or you were just one of many voices?
I felt probably two things. I think I felt one that there was genuine interest and curiosity in the advice, to the point of the way the engagement was happening, and um the conversations I was part of. Um, but at the same time, I think I was probably one of many, and that may just be my impression of just from the organization, right? Which, um, look, like I say this because I think it was probably a tough dynamic for any candidate to be in a situation where you have a team and an infrastructure that was not your own, and everyone's is operating under one assumption, and now it's a different one, and you're trying to figure out how to work with one another. Um,
Mhm.
but it also did seem like there were a lot of kind of cooks in the messaging kitchen, so to speak. And I also found there was a lot of reliance or focus on the tactics first. And I come from a belief and a philosophy like you kind of need to know what you're saying first, and you need to know what you're trying to do before you really get hung up on the tactics. But that seemed to be kind of from an operational perspective where the
Yeah.
time was spent,
I
versus
feel
on like
like,
what are we talking about when we do this interview? So
well, this goes back to, I think, who is Kamala Harris?
yeah,
And I think that, what comes through in all your memos, you've shared them all with me. Or at least, I don't know if you shared them all. You've shared a bunch
I
with
think I
me.
did.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
What comes, it's what's missing that is glaring to me, which is I still reading all your memos. I felt like you were you were viewing this through the prism of the voters that are available to you, and how do you talk to the voters that are available to you, which is what a good strategist should be doing.
Yeah.
But the core problem with Kamala Harris, and this goes back to her presidential campaign in 2019, right? I call it 2019 because she kind of got out, right, at the end of that calendar year, right before the turn, really before Iowa. Who is she, right? You know, she was at times trying to be a progressive. Then she's like, well, I'm not going to be that progressive. I'm going to be a little bit over here, right? And she's, you know, I've had this thesis on her that she was talked into running for president, that this was not, I'm somebody who believes that if you haven't thought about running for president since, since you basically became an adult, right? If you weren't thinking about it in high school, you probably don't have what it takes to get all the way there. You almost have to be obsessive about it, right? Bill Clinton at Boise State, right? That dude was campaigning for president, in high school. I think Rudy Giuliani's a guy that you feel like was always on the move, right? It strikes me Chris Christie was always had a goal, was goal oriented, right? You just sort of know. You know, she felt like consultants. It always felt like to me when you look, she got talked into something. I look at her and I say the first office she ever ran for was DA. And I'm guessing it's because that's what she wanted to do. Yeah. And I think the law, and I think the, sort of being on the prosecution side is a way to try to sort of create more fairness in the justice system. I genuinely believe that was sort of where, and so I've always thought that my guess is if I got to know 25-year-old Kamala Harris, her goal was to be a Supreme Court justice or the Attorney General of the United States. And somehow somebody whispered in her ear, you could be president. You could be the first woman president. And you don't unhear those things, right? When enough people tell you, suddenly you're like, yeah, why not? Hey, maybe I can be president, right? Like you have this, and I've watched people grab that bug because somebody planted the seed in their head and suddenly they think, why not? Versus, was it really a core goal? Because if it wasn't a core goal, then you're going to continue to have these identity issues. And I feel like she had ideological identity issues in the first campaign and in this one.
Yeah.
Which might explain why she never did the Rogan interview, right? Which might explain why she didn't do some of these things. But that's my take. What did you see?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely, I think you're right. I agree with you in the sense that I don't know that she knew who she is. I don't know that she felt comfortable and confident in doing the things that you need to do when you're running for office, right? Because there is an inherent vulnerability in running for office and exposing yourself to people and revealing who you are and trying to get them to trust you and kind of bring them into the fold. And I think I get why that can be totally uncomfortable. Which if that's the case, it's probably the wrong business to be in.
Right.
But so my sense is that that is much harder when you don't know innately what it is you believe, right? Because at some point, like the talking point ends, and then you're struggling, right? So if you're not in a completely controlled environment, or you don't know where the question is going to go, or it's too dynamic, if you don't feel comfortable, one, saying I don't know, or maybe actually being reflective or kind of pushing back when someone disagrees with you and being a little bit uncomfortable, that I think it just makes it tough to engage. And that's what struck me, like, when they were looking for kind of my thoughts on Rogan. And I think I write it in the memo in the sense of, it wasn't saying you should do this, but it really was like, if you're going to do it, you really need to do it this way. And if you can't do it this way, like, you shouldn't bother doing it at all, because it's not enough to just check the box. And I felt sometimes that was the thinking, right? If we just check the box that we did this thing, like we checked the box that we did the Fox interview, and it's like, that's not enough, right? When you go in there, you have to understand that how are you communicating to that audience, and what is this showing, and how are you revealing yourself in a way that they're gonna trust you a little bit or get a little more comfortable with you. So I felt like sometimes we were just checking the box on something to do it without really exploring, okay, well, what is it that I'm going to say, and how am I going to engage in this when I do it?
Let me highlight one of my favorite parts of one memo, because this really chapped me the whole time, and it bothered me during Biden's campaign in 20, and this one, right, which is the following. Instead of Republicans for Harris, how do we make it Harris for Republicans? This general framework is applicable to independents and moderate undecideds, as well as because it creates a structure that either makes it possible to vote for her or comfortable enough not to turn out to vote for Trump. I just thought that framing, and this is just one piece of one memo you wrote, I just thought that framing, I never felt Joe Biden knew how to basically, how do I make the case to the Bush Republicans that I care about their issues, not just that, hey, we are in agreement that Trump's unconstitutional.
Right.
Trump's not a constitutionalist, and this is a threat to the republic. But that was all they had. That was almost like Biden, and frankly, by the end, Harris, it was all they had in common.
Yeah.
Right. Rather than saying, well, what are some issues that actually they care about besides Trump's inability to follow the Constitution?
Right.
And how was this memo received?
I, I feel initially, well, I mean, there was a conversation in a call that I was a part of, where we kind of walked through it, or I walked through it in part because I think the way they were framing it, they were even framing me coming in as a Republican, and this kind of idea that only a Republican can speak to a Republican, and that whole effort, which was trying to recruit sort of, frankly, most people who were former Republicans at that point, or Republicans of a different era, as sort of spokespeople. And I was really adamant, like, that was not effective. And, some of these folks who I love them all, like, God bless Susan Molinari, but like, no one knows who she is anymore. And it's
Right.
really not relevant. And in some cases, it's actually counterintuitive, and it's not helpful because the way they're carrying that message actually doesn't connect with the individual. And so there seemed to be sort of, we would initially kind of get to like, yes, that makes sense. Cause I was asked the question, I remember on one call, someone asked me like, Maria, like, so can we ask you like, how effective is Liz Cheney? Like, is she as effective as like we think she is? And I was like, no, like,
No,
no.
that's amazing. That disconnect. So they really thought, and look, I mean, I've known Liz Cheney a long time. I've always sort of admired her steel spine, right? Even when she's been disagreeable to certain ideas. But it was pretty clear. I mean, it's frankly, the only person less effective at wooing a Republican might have been Mitch McConnell.
Right. Yes.
Right?
Right. Yeah. And I think that kind of goes, I guess, to the point I was trying to make, that at the end of the day, it's the job of a candidate to earn the vote. And there was, I think, from a tactical perspective, an over reliance or a belief that if you're using surrogates or others to speak for you, somehow that was more effective. And so in a lot of ways, was just like, I think that the message from the top down is what you need
Yeah.
to fix, and how you're using your candidate.
You know what bothered me? It's like, look, I wish they would have thought like a parliamentary system, which is, look, the Democrats don't have a majority in this country. Okay, but the Democrats plus the constitutionalists in the middle, among independents, I don't even know if I want to call it the middle, but among independents and sort of the constitutional Republicans, right?
Mhm.
There was a common cause there. So it's a coalition.
Yeah.
And in parliamentary systems, you give the coalition something.
Right.
You're like, hey, you know what? I know my base believes in this, but like, I wanted to see her say, I'm going to make Liz Cheney DHS secretary.
Yeah.
Then you're sending a message. I want a conservative Republican who sort of believes in, border security, who understands what it is, the meaning of it, also from an agricultural state, who understands the need for migrants, right? But the point is, like, and neither Biden or Harris could bring themselves to do that, right? At the end of the day, and this to me is the Democratic Party's problem, they're afraid. You gave multiple times, the advice you were giving is, hey, go after the left on something. Whatever, maybe it's on law and order in the cities. Maybe it is at the border. We didn't get it right. Throw a bone there.
Yeah.
And the fact that they could never get there. And I don't know if this is groupthink around. I certainly I think it took a change in chief of staff for Biden to finally focus on the border. That's just my observation. But it's stunning to me how often you were making that case. And They could never get there. There isn't, what made Trump appealing to some in the middle was his ability to go after sacred cows on the right.
Yeah.
Even if they were sacred cows, you're like, why are you doing that one? Didn't matter,
Right.
right? It
Right.
sent the message that I'm not going to be conventional.
Right.
It never sent the message that she was going to be anything other than a conventional liberal Democratic president.
Right. 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 No, I think that's right. And so it was, there'd be times where she was saying, or the campaign was trying to tell you she was going to be different, but in no way were they showing that. Right. And I think
Right. There was
like
no example. Yeah.
right. There was nothing
Do
people could kind of hang their hat on. They're like, okay. Like, and I think, the other thing, and I felt this probably more on a personal level, but I was very much like, look, you guys are very much like country over party, but you're also very much like country over party just for one party. So you
Mhm.
kind of like it has to be both. And I just, you know, there was just the fact that there was also a group of voters who were open, right? Who just needed to get comfortable enough with her that were like there for the taking, that like couldn't land the plane on. I think um it's frustrating, and it sort of says it all, because on what you have a guy that like most people disliked immensely,
Right.
didn't want to vote for, but then looked at the options and like, well, I guess I'll either stay home or I'll still vote for this guy. And
Right.
so you have to at least then, at least coming out of that, be a little bit reflective about what that says about your party.
Well, and look, I think ultimately, if you're still looking for one moment that symbolizes why she lost, it's the moment on The View when she said
Oh,
she couldn't
sure.
think of one thing, right?
Yeah.
Like, forget
Yeah.
anything else, right? That
Yeah.
ultimately, that was the moment, right?
Yeah.
That crystallizes, nobody watches The View, so I'm not going to sit here and say
Right.
but it was the perception, it was the clip,
Yeah.
it reinforced a stereotype many had, right? It
Yeah.
also, you know, and look, I don't know. I sort of come at this. I don't know if a sitting vice president under any circumstance could win an election if the president that they serve under has an approval rating under 50, right?
Yeah.
We only have 3 or 4 examples, and and they all sort of, the winner, the one that won, H.W. Bush, had a president with approval rating over 60. Right? Bill
Yeah.
Clinton had
Yeah.
character challenges that was holding Gore back. LBJ had Vietnam problems that was holding Humphrey back. And, this really, to me, she really is Humphrey 68. It's the same in that she just could never get out from under the unpopularity of the Biden
Yeah.
administration. Humphrey could
Yeah.
never get out. He late came out against the war, said it was a mistake, right? Like, he
Yeah.
did throw Johnson very late under the bus. And guess what? He only lost by a percentage point, right? Like, the popular vote was super, super close. So there was something. There was something there that voters wanted to, come on, tell us,
Yeah. Yeah. I'm waiting for it.
waiting for it. And she never, and you just wonder, was that worth a point?
Yeah.
We're not looking for 10-point swing here. You're looking for a
No,
1-point swing.
no. I
Yeah.
mean, particularly when you look at, I know when you kind of like take a step back, it looks like, okay, when you look at the map, it looks overwhelming, but then you look at some of those close margins, in the battlegrounds, and you're right. It's, we're talking about a point and a half, maybe 2 points. And so, it wasn't impossible. I do think, you're right in the sense that, and I feel this, that I think it was an impossible scenario for her to be put in with such a
Correct. Yeah.
but I think that's why I think it also speaks to how the Biden campaign was operating even before she got there, and frankly, the positioning like of that campaign. And as you were saying, like even his campaign was really making this all about, referendum on the future of democracy. And look, at the end of the day, like one, it's just way too esoteric of a concept for an actual person to wrap their head around and think that that's what the stakes are on the ballot. But it again means that you really kind of, and ultimately sort of cap out, right? All of the people who are going to vote for you based on that concept, you already have at some point. So you at
Yeah.
some point have to pivot and start figuring how you earn the votes of the people who that's not going to sway.
You write this on October 4th memo. You say it's 30 days to go, and you make this point about the never Trump Republicans. Hey, you don't need to campaign with them anymore. You almost don't need them. They're already there. They're not. And in some ways, you write this on October 4th, and yet what was the closing argument?
Right. Yeah.
right? It might as well have been written by George Conway and Bill Kristol at the Bulwark, right? And God bless them.
Right.
I mean,
Right.
you know,
Right.
but that they were already on board. You didn't need a
Yeah.
message to get them on board. You needed a
Yeah.
message to get people who were like, "Hey, you guys sucked at this. What are
Yeah.
you going to do differently? Biden was terrible at this. What are you going to do differently?"
Right. And I think, well, I mean, to that point, I mean, the closing argument and like the speech on the mall, right? You're picking a location that invokes something very specific. Again, is that how you want to end your campaign on?
I'm curious, were you involved in that decision-making process? Did you say, "Hey, I'm
Not
not sure
in
this
the,
is my favorite idea"? Because I mean, it the minute she did it, it was like,
I know.
"Really?
I
What are you
know.
doing here?" And then of course, I think something stepped on it that day, if I remember.
I
There was
think
some
that's right. I can't remember what it was, but it
can't
did. Well,
either, but it
one,
was something, you know, this is the problem with our attention economy, right? Like you can
totally.
you try to plan a big event, you've got to be prepared for it to just, get undone by
Something else.
chaos.
Well,
Yeah.
but that's also why, I mean, getting to the message in a second, from a tactical perspective, doing your closing argument speech like a week out before the election is like not the world we live in anymore, right? Like this
Mhm.
isn't like 1988. Your closing argument, frankly, needs to be, you need to be whatever the version of the closing argument is that you're landing the plane on day in and day out. You need to at least be starting like 30 days out, right? People are
By the
going to be
way,
starting to vote. Like,
by the way, I mean, I want to, because it's funny you just said that about closing argument messages, that you don't do them this late. So my son turned 18 this year, but he was really following the presidential for the first time.
yeah,
And so he'd sit there and he'd be like, and we watch a lot of sports, and of course, in a campaign now, the only advertisements are beer, gambling, and sport and
yeah, yeah,
politics, right? In a
yeah,
campaign here,
yeah,
because it's the only place you can
yeah,
advertise and feel like you can get
yeah,
a cross section audience, right? So he'd sit there and he said, "Man, these ads suck." Like he goes,
yeah,
and he's not wrong. And I understand
yeah,
what he meant. He goes, "There's no creativity to them. They're all kind of formulaic." So I went on the Living Room Candidate, which is this fabulous historic website of presidential campaign ads by cycle. And it starts with 1952. And I'm telling you, it's a rabbit hole if you're kind of a historic political junkie.
yeah.
Once you go down that rabbit hole, you'll be there for an hour and you go, "Jesus Christ, what am I doing?" Well, I got lost. I started to show, and basically it was 1988 we went from having creative ads before 1988, like jingles, and people would write their own
Yeah.
songs. Literally, my son's like, "Well, how come they don't do that anymore? Kennedy, 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 Kennedy," or
Right.
try to make you laugh and all this stuff. And I said, "Yeah," I said, "because they have too much data now, and they just are trying to talk to specific groups." And
Right.
you really see the transition in 88. But it's funny you say this. I recommend everybody. So Michael Dukakis buys a 5-minute national TV spot the Sunday before the election. And in and it's supposed to be a closing message. And instead, it's an airing of grievances. And it's just him going, "I'm sorry you didn't get to know who I was. I'm sorry that the way that this
Oh my
process works."
God.
And you're like, "Oh my God." Like, no wonder he lost. No wonder Bush got 400 electoral votes. Like, if you were on the fence and you watched that, you're like, "Well, this is just a cranky technocrat from Boston." It was literally
Right.
like the Red Sox fans complaining about the umpires, right? And this was his 5-minute closing argument. And I remember saying, "Boy, you should show this to every single political communications class." I'll tell you what you
Yeah.
don't do as a closing message. So
Right, right,
I
right.
recommend after this,
I'm
go
gonna
look
watch
at
it.
you got to go watch it. It's his 5-minute closing spot. It's on the Living Room Candidate. And you're just like, I can't believe anybody allowed. My guess is
Right.
everybody had given up on the campaign. Say what you want, Governor. Go
Right,
ahead.
right. It's
Right?
over. It's
Write the
over.
speech
Yeah.
that you want. Now, she never did that type of closing message, but she didn't it didn't meet the voters where they were, right? And that's
No.
ultimately the problem, right? You got to meet
Yeah.
voters where they are.
No, totally right. And there's ways to do that with and maybe the message, putting the message aside, there's ways to that are more effective. And I think if you're gonna do sort of a big moment in this day and age,
Mhm.
you need to know how you're kind of landing the plane on the takeaway message up front, and I think that was a little bit of the conversation I had in terms of when I was asked for feedback after it was already a foregone conclusion. But again, like you have to treat this like the main takeaway that you want everyone to pay attention to needs to happen right off the top. And there was also back and forth, and I can't remember actually where the final speech, ended up on this, but sort of if you're going to be there and you have the optics being what they are and the press is sort of alluding to January 6th, like there's really no reason to mention it in your speech. And in some respects, one of the things I said was you might be better off not mentioning Trump at all.
Mhm.
But I think this is like a larger problem for the Democratic Party. And frankly, I think it's also going to be a problem for the Republican Party post Trump, is that like Trump's made everybody lazy, right? So
Oh,
it's like,
it's so. Thank you for saying it that way. I feel like the one I've always said, the Trump era is easy as a
yeah,
political analyst because it is. We really have gotten dumb, right?
yeah,
And dumb
yeah,
and lazy with our messaging, dumb and lazy with how we appeal to voters, dumb and lazy. And part of that, I don't know how much of that is social media algorithms rewarding dumb and lazy too. Like I think that feeds into it, right? Because
yeah.
that helps sort of drive mass content movement and stuff. But God, thank you
It's
for, it's refreshing to hear that. It is so true.
it's
A lot
just,
of,
I mean, look, yeah. Yeah. I mean, I look and like Republicans, I mean, look, Republicans just follow whatever Trump says, right? So it'll be interesting when he's not there to follow, how to like whatever the next, class of Republican candidates are, how do they figure out who they are, right? And how do they speak that language? And I think for Democrats, right, it's just been this fallback, that Trump's so terrible. And when that's the case for Democrats and then certainly for Republicans, you never have to figure out like what you're for. And, I do think that's the harder thing, but it ultimately is the thing that brings people with you and wins you votes. And
well,
it's
look,
just
we
it's
haven't had a president who won by as much by what they were for than what they weren't since Obama '08, right?
yeah.
He, in
Yeah.
some ways, was successful. You've got to be able to, and, which, by the way, is the reason why he's the only candidate to win by more than 5 points this century,
Yeah.
right? Everything else has
Yeah.
been a vote against election. Well,
Yeah.
I don't know if I trust that person, so I'm going to go with this person.
Yeah. Right. Right. People are picking the lesser of two evils, right? I mean, and
Right.
and I think the last cycle was really instructive to that. I mean, one, you have people who don't identify the same way as they did with traditional party structures. You had the majority of people actually not like, and this was when Biden was still in the race, like either
Hmm.
candidate. And so
Right.
so there is an opportunity there. Like it does exist. It's
Hmm.
just, taking the time and figuring out how to get to it. And the truth is getting to it may not mean success overnight. I think that is what, like we all struggle with, right? That you're not winning, you're not, because everything is about, winning an election, the majority, having the majority, even though I feel like we live in a day and age where once a party has the majority, they have no idea what to do with the majority. So it's like, what are we
Hmm.
amassing this power for from a
Right.
policy perspective? Um, but like I do think there is an opportunity there, and I do think whichever party figures it out will be successful kind of coming off of the Trump years.
Do you think there's any room? I vacillate on this. Like, there's a part of me that says, boy, both parties are kind of weak, which is why Sanders and Trump so easily became leaders inside the party, right? They
Yeah.
just sort of, they're kind of, I've always said they were kind of dead carcasses. There was a dead elephant and a dead donkey, and they can get reanimated at any given
Yeah.
time. Do you think there's room for a third party, an independent, or is it more of the, there's room temporarily for a sober candidate until till the two parties figure it out, like a la Perot?
I don't know. I think if there is room, it has to be not an individual, but there has to be an idea or an issue that's like driving it. And I mean, kind of historically, when you look at it, that's when a third party or a party kind of evolution has really had the most success. And it takes time. I think, when we kind of look at what was trying to happen with no labels last time, that's
Hmm.
like that's an organization based on tactics, right? It's not based on
Yeah,
like a
yeah.
philosophy or an ideology. There's
No, this is
nothing to
what the
get people
Forward Party.
behind
I bet
you.
I've
Yeah,
spent a
like
lot of time with the organizers there, and they're wrestling with this when,
yeah,
because they have like some of their supporters are supporters for tactical reasons, and some of
yeah,
their supporters are supporters looking for a true independent vision that's unique from the two parties.
yeah,
And yet if they come up with a platform, it could scare people. You know, the potential collection of non-R's and
yeah,
D's is a fascinating group of people. The problem
yeah.
is, other than not being a member of the two major parties, they don't have a lot in common.
Right. Right, which is which is right. How do you figure out, which is maybe then like whoever builds it, I
Mhm.
don't need needs to maybe not be from a traditional party apparatus. I think
Right.
look, I think it's interesting. I do think it has to be based in something that people can get behind, like from a like philosophy of governance, something that you're like, okay, I believe in this. And maybe
Mhm.
the truth is, which I think a lot of times it has been one issue because that usually it is one issue that can get people from divergent ideological spectrums to come together. But I do think in the Trump era, and so I think it was tough. Like when you look at the last cycle, putting aside the no rules, I think
Right.
organizational issue, I think I felt because we kind of looked at this when Christie got out, we kind of did it as a like, let's do it as like an academic experiment. Like, let's look at the numbers, break down, what we're seeing, and could you
No,
do
and I had
this?
heard Christie certainly
Yeah,
answered the phone when the no
yeah.
labels people called and say, okay, tell me what you got, but could never be convinced that it was viable.
Right. So we kind of went through it, and you could see in the
Hmm.
states that there was a pool of gettable voters. Like that
Right.
was feasible. But then you had the issue of money, right? At that point in time, ballot
Hmm.
access, which, frankly,
Always,
was a
that's the
huge lift.
biggest problem. Right.
And then we kind of had this other, which is more abstract. It is just, even though the world we live in is very fractured from a media perspective, there is still, and maybe you disagree with this, there's still sort of the establishment media sort of setting the tone of like the horse race and sort of who's up, who's down in a race, right? And we kind of felt like it would be very difficult unless you had maybe some former Republicans who were waiting, like a Mitt Romney or someone else like that, who like came out and
Hmm.
supported you at the same time. And
Right.
even then, we felt it would be very difficult to get out of the gate and not have everyone immediately viewing you as being a spoiler or
Right.
taking votes away from Trump, because so much of the dialogue at that point was around, oh, we can't have like Trump be president, right? And we even kind of said, could you even do this to have a conversation that kind of forces the parties? Because I'm a
Right.
believer in that. Like that's part of the reason why, frankly, like when Christie ran, it was interesting. It was like we need someone with this voice in the
Yep.
race. And, we just view particularly this last cycle, it just felt you couldn't get over that it would immediately be at the polling numbers and then it becomes self-fulfilling and then the race and the substance itself isn't covered.
Hmm.
Um, and just would be hard to get out from behind that. Which doesn't mean you couldn't potentially do it at a later date, or maybe it's post-Trump with more
Hmm.
time. But it's certainly difficult. Like I think it's really difficult.
Yeah, no, I think, and I don't know how much of this is just the political dork in me or the anthropologist. I always say at this point, I feel like I'm a political anthropologist more than anything else, trying to figure out how these various tribes, how do
Yeah.
they interact with the actual civilization of people, right?
Right.
Um, but one, I had a fever dream about Bill McRaven as sort of the perfect antidote for the time we're living in, which is you get a military leader who says,
Yeah.
you know what, look, I don't have it. I haven't gone deep on many of these issues. I'm not going to tell you that I have a specific answer about the border other than it's ridiculous how this works. Our asylum system is broken. And here's what I am going to promise you is I'm going to bring together this group, and we're going to put together a plan in 90 days. Because one thing I'm good at in the military is
Yeah.
conceiving of a plan and executing it. And we're going to be sort of a solutions based. And hey, we're going to try to update the Constitution for the democracy that we have in 21st century America, maybe all of that. I think we're not there yet, right? I think that
Right.
there's not a big enough constituency to say, you know what, the system is broken, right? You can't, the two parties are only going to exploit a broken system for power, which is what
Sure.
I feel like we're in right now, which is
Yep.
whenever either one of them gets power. So let's change the Senate rules to do this, or let's change the Senate rules to just get our way rather than saying, hey, are we building a worse judiciary by doing it this way? Are we building a
Yeah.
worse Congress by
Yeah.
doing it this way?
Yeah.
And I think, unfortunately, there isn't enough, and this gets it. Charlie Cook and I had two old guys yell at a cloud type of conversation last week, which was,
The
he's like,
best
they don't
kind.
know,
The best
right?
kind.
Because it was this whole like, people don't understand why the Constitution has the compromise in it that it has. And that if
Right.
it's one thing to know that there are three branches of government, 9 people in the Supreme Court, blah, blah, blah. That's not when we say we've got a civics problem. It's sort of understanding, well, why did we end up with it this way? Well, because they actually couldn't come to this agreement. So they created a system to force compromise. And if more people understood the system at its best is about compromise, not one side wins and the other side loses,
Yep.
right? Then which is really the 20th century mindset, right? I've always said the end of the Cold War got rid of our sober brain, part of our brain,
Yeah.
because both parties kept their fringes at bay during the Cold
Yeah.
War because we had a North
Yeah.
Star. Hey,
Yeah.
we're,
Common
we're
enemy.
promoting
No.
democracy. We're all in the same team when we go overseas, right? This whole
Yeah.
idea that you don't criticize outside the water's edge is really a Cold War phenomenon, right? It was only
Yeah.
that is not how we behaved pre-World War II, and it's not
Yeah.
how we behave today. And I've always now lamented it turns out you and I grew up with a political system that actually might have been an outlier,
Yeah.
right? And even a media ecosystem that was an outlier, right? The most partisan media outside of this era is actually the era pre-World War II, right? Between
Yeah.
during the 19th century and the early 20th century. So,
Yep.
we I think, and so I don't think we're there just yet, but we're close.
Yeah.
We certainly are close. That I think I'd want to be, if I were a candidate running for office in either 26 or 28, the number one thing I'd want people to think of me as is a reformer, right?
Yeah.
Whatever that means, right? I'm going to reform
Right.
this, reform. I'm a reformer. I'm not happy with how this works. I'm going to fix it. I'm a
Yeah.
reformer. And look, Trump comes across as a guy who wants to change things, right?
Yes. Yep.
Radically so and all this stuff. And this gets at the core. Kamala Harris never said she wanted to change a thing.
Right.
And I think that was that's the core missing piece, I think, that the
No.
Democrats.
Yeah, I think that's right. Or and also thinking like almost thinking people want it to go back to the way it was before Trump. And you're actually like, no, people don't want it to go back to that. There's a reason they voted for Trump.
No,
And
there's a
that's
reason they voted for Obama. Like, I go
right.
back, the
Yeah.
original
I mean,
sin
some
was
of the same
Obama.
voters.
I
Yeah.
sit here and say the original sin was Obama endorsing Hillary. It's
Yeah.
no, this is now knock on her. It was just that she was representative of the era that they were saying no more of the Bushes and the Clintons.
Right. We're
Like,
done with this.
so
Yeah.
instead it became no more Bushes, Clintons, and it took Donald Trump to get rid of the Bushes and the Clintons, when
Yeah.
actually Barack Obama was elected to do that.
Yeah.
And he chose not to.
Yeah. It's interesting. It's like the establishments get like very comfortable and like
Mhm.
afraid, right? And I mean,
Yeah.
I look at this on the Republican side, when you kind of take a look back and sort of, because I think, particularly after 16, when everyone was sort of like, how did we get here? How did Trump actually become the nominee? And I was like, this is actually not that surprising. And I would use
No.
this, tell this story of, I think it was like 2011, Christie had appointed a judge who was Muslim, and it had been someone who he had worked with when he was a U.S. attorney. I think was helpful in terms of facilitating relationships kind of post 9/11 with the Muslim community, intelligence perspective and otherwise. And we were getting a lot of crap from the right on it,
Mhm.
practicing Sharia law, et cetera, et cetera. Okay. And it's like 2011. And I remember, at a press conference, one of the Jersey press corps asks him this question. They're like, you're getting a lot of, you're getting attacked on the right about this. And he stopped and he was like, this is crazy. And then he kind of went through individuals' credentials and like very matter of factly. And, we kind of looked at that moment or New Jersey, it was very, dynamic in the way he answered it. So of course we like, cut it and pushed it
Woohoo!
around and
We
we're
did it.
like, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it's interesting because, like really kind of all the sort of typical outlets that you would think kind of like a slightly left of center, like applauded what he said, right? You Morning
Sure.
Joe's, Huffington Post, blah, blah, blah.
Yeah.
And who didn't say anything, sort of what you would call the establishment, the intellectual part of the right. And then I'm kind of talking about the national reviews, et cetera, et cetera. And
Wall Street Journal Ed Board, right?
yeah,
Yeah.
like there was
Yeah.
no
Yeah.
sort of coming out and sort of like essentially saying that they agreed and we can't have this kind of rhetoric in our party, right? And I had a conversation with an editor of again, you wouldn't think of this as in like you as like MAGA media in today, but like again, establishment conservative media. We were talking about how, there'd been a lot of this on the site. We've been through this, how it's not accurate that he's practicing Sharia law as a judge. And the editor was kind of like, look, I don't condone it, but like I can't control, what's on the site. And you're like, well, okay. So much for
Okay.
being an editor in chief here. But
Yeah.
then, you fast forward and you have a Republican nominee who's, who's as part of his platform saying we're banning Muslims from coming into the country, and we're all suddenly shocked by it, right? And
Right.
it's sort of that slow creep of the establishment, and this is whatever we're calling kind of the intellectual establishment, the folks who've been in office, the donor class, right? Nobody wanted to touch it for fear of losing a race or being primaried. And so when you don't say anything, right, and you kind of let it fester, like this is what you get. And you can't, and I always found it to just be, I don't, disingenuous isn't the right word, but I just found that entire group of people who then were so shocked and upset with Trump and had no ability to kind of look inward and be like, how was I part of how we got here? Right. To be
Hmm.
part of, I think part of the reason why people actually
Yep.
were kind of like, we're done with the establishment of this
Right.
party because you guys are kind of full of it. So I don't disagree.
Um, I know I promised an hour, but there's like two other topics I'd like to get with you. If you
Okay.
have a few more minutes, are you
Yeah. Yeah.
okay with
Yeah.
that?
I'm
Okay.
okay. Yeah.
So topic one is sort of where it's interesting. We both avoided this. Which Republicans have been comfortable breaking with Trump? And there's only two that I find that I think could be interesting presidential candidates because it does seem as if they know who they are regardless of
Hmm.
Trump. And it's Rand Paul and Josh Hawley. Those are the
Oh,
two that
interesting.
stand out to me right now, right?
Yeah.
Paul has decided to double down on being sort of the small government guy, believing that there's still room for that. I think that at his core, right, and he's uncomfortable with some of the tactics of law enforcement. He always right. That's part of his libertarian wiring, a little
Yeah.
bit. And then you got a Holly who I think understands the Trump base better than Trump does. Right? He's the guy realizing, hey, don't you
Yeah.
know who our voters are? Like, he
Yeah.
actually and Missouri is who they're, Missouri, if your message on the right works in Missouri, it's going to work everywhere type of
Yeah.
right now on the
Yeah.
right. So those two stand out to me. Who stands out to you that you think might be able to, because in order to succeed, you're not going to be able to be fully anti-Trump, right? You've got to be Trump adjacent, but different.
Maybe. Well,
At
I
least
think
on the
that,
right, at
well,
least for the Republican nomination in 28.
I think, well, I think you need to be able to speak to what works about Trump. Um, I think you can't be like a never Trumper, anti-Trump, like, throwing him aside, right? You have to kind of acknowledge, the things that clearly have resonated. And I think, that, but I'm always hesitant to then say it has to be like Trump adjacent because I am curious about. I think that kind of boxes you in, right? Like, is the Republican who's successful at that able to tap into the same sentiment that's made Trump successful, but makes it very uniquely their own
Is
because
it
no
their
one
own?
else can
Right.
can truly emulate him, right? And that
Yeah.
if you try to emulate him, you're actually not going to be as successful at it.
No, I think we've all learned that over time that anybody that tries to be a copy, a miniature of a
Yeah,
successful, it never works, right?
yeah,
It just never works.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. But if you're asking for like names, I feel like I don't have any. I mean,
Yeah.
yours are actually pretty good. If I like thinking about it, like I can see they're on the rand. I have to give Josh a little more thought. Um, but I think I've struggled with that, and I've kind of been hopeful that there's somebody out there that we don't know about yet. When
Yeah.
I
I,
think
do,
of,
I don't buy into Kemp, right? I don't know if he's got the
yeah,
personality, the charisma. I say this
yeah,
with, that's so, not
affection, yeah,
everybody
yeah,
does, but,
yeah,
I think
yeah,
he's ideologically in the correct spot, but do you
yeah,
have it, right? We all know that's that,
right,
elusive thing, right? And
yeah,
DeSantis has that problem, right?
yeah,
In that there's just
yeah,
a personality flaw there
yeah,
that more than anything.
yeah,
Um,
yeah,
and so it is hard to see who, and then the other candidates, right? Vance is just going to be, whatever's, is sort of like any sitting vice president. You can't get out from under your president, right? You
right,
either
right,
run, you either embrace it or you don't, right? And
right,
and
right,
you can be Mike Pence and
right,
finish near the bottom, or you can
yeah,
embrace, and then there's
right,
guys like Greg Abbott, who I think also will try to just run as a mini me
yeah,
versus, so you're right. I don't see any. The only two that seem to be trying. That's why they're the. And I guess Glenn Youngkin is. Hey, I'm the guy that kind of looks like the Bush era, but doesn't hate Trump,
right,
right? Like,
right,
and I just
right.
don't know. That
Yeah,
feels
I
like,
don't know. Yeah,
yeah,
it
that
feels like a
feels too
bygone
watered down.
era.
Yeah,
Yeah, it
yeah,
feels like a bygone era, which I think there was like so many candidates where I think like the donor class and like a certain class would always be
Mhm.
like, this is the next big candidate. And
Right.
inevitably, no.
Yeah.
So I feel like he kind of falls into that camp. But
Um, Anybody on the Democratic side that you think might be able to successfully, as I'm going to quote your memo again, um, do something, that are, candidate X, what candidate X will do for Republicans who don't like Trump versus just being, a candidate for people, for the never Trumpers.
yeah, I feel like I'm watching folks. I mean, I'm intrigued by the moves the new mayor of San Francisco is making. I think is
Hmm.
interesting.
Daniel
It just
Lurie, right? He's the
yeah.
heir of the. We've got like, is he Levi Strauss?
Maybe. I don't want to say definitively.
Yeah,
I feel
I'm
like I
not
should know that,
100%
but
sure either.
yeah.
Yeah, I should know
Yeah.
that too. So anyway, go ahead.
Yeah.
But yes,
But
he is
yeah.
a different type of Democratic mayor, sort
Yeah.
of, law and order, sort of Bill Clinton type
Yeah.
might be the best way to
Yeah.
describe. Yeah.
Well, and I just probably am biased towards, if you're a mayor or a governor and you kind of have that executive leadership, right? So you kind of like, how does that actually, you have something tangible you have to figure out, right? So I think that's
Mm-hmm.
interesting to look at. Um, I think like I mean, I can see like the charisma and the appeal of like a Westmore, Sheer is also interesting. I think it'll be interesting. I'm more curious to see how they kind of play out over the next year or so. I feel like I don't. I feel like I have this like it's sort of on the edges. Oh, you could be interesting, but it's
Yeah.
like too soon to tell.
I just double checked. He is Levi Strauss.
All right,
He
good.
is an
Okay.
heir to the Levi
All
Strauss.
right. Well,
That's intriguing. And then of course I got to close with New York City Mayor and Andrew
sure.
Cuomo.
Yeah.
You know him
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
well. It's interesting. I was seeing a pretty good analysis about how it here's what is fascinating to me, because you lived the 2016 campaign and on the Republican side, and I'm watching the sort of the Manhattan elite. They're like, it
Mhm.
reminds me of the Republican elite of
Oh yeah.
2016, the
Uh-huh,
Stop
uh-huh.
Trump movement and the Stop Mamdani movement. Hey,
Yeah.
maybe if everybody agrees, right, Cruz and Rubio, one has to drop out, or Cruz and Kasich, one has to
Yeah.
drop out, and nobody will drop out, right?
Yeah.
And you see the polling, right? Hey, do you want Trump or somebody that isn't Trump? Well, we want somebody that isn't Trump. Look like that really polls well because there's no
Yeah.
person that connected to it.
Sure.
Just like
Yep.
Mamdani, you see this polling. Well, an anti-Mamdani candidate could get 55% of the vote. Great.
Yeah.
Who is it?
Right. Right. Who is
You
that
can't,
person?
right. And this feels like a field of extraordinarily flawed candidates. Like it,
Yep.
to me, the only one that I would rally around is the guy we know the least about, Walden.
Yeah.
Like give
Yes.
me
Yeah.
the
Yeah.
no nay, right? Rather than
Right.
Cuomo and all the
Right.
baggage he comes with,
Right.
Adams and his
Right.
and the
And Walden's
guardian
a very nice
angel,
guy.
right? And
Yeah.
the guardian angel guy who I noticed finally took the fedora off, right?
Yeah.
God bless him. But it is, and yet there still seems to be this. Well, we can stop Mamdani. We can stop Mamdani, and it's like,
Right.
you could, but not with this crowd.
Right. Not with the cans. Yep. No, it's funny you say that because I've actually felt it's very similar and
Mhm.
to 16 or just in general, sort of what happens when, a donor class or like a certain, particularly in here in New York, I don't know if they necessarily have a political affiliation, but they're just like wealthy, right? Suddenly
Right.
decides, right, something's not moving in the direction, right, that they wanted it to. And so there becomes like a panic. Because I remember saying to folks here early on when everyone was like, it's a foregone conclusion, it's Cuomo, everyone's
Boy, I
getting
never
behind him,
understood
all this
that.
money. I literally said, I've seen this movie before. And I
Yeah,
go,
what are you
actually,
doing?
every time there's a group of like wealthy donors who get involved and like panic donate a lot of money and get behind a candidate, it usually ends up being wrong because they're
Right.
like furthest from the pulse of the electorate. And I think that's what, and look, like part of what I think happened here, I feel is not surprising. I mean, you're putting money behind, Cuomo, who was a flawed candidate, right? Was not likable. So it was trying to force something that, was at odds. And I think it really speaks volumes to just the Democratic Party here and the fact that there's no bench, right? It sort of shocks me
Mm.
that here in New York, like there was not anyone else like the Democratic
Well,
Party
I
could
don't
have
get it
figured the
either.
role.
I mean, this is where I really hold Jeffries and Schumer more accountable than others do, because this is your backyard. You're the two leaders. Look, there's nobody else in charge of the party right now, whether you like it or not, right? And if you can't,
Right.
your job is to do what's in the best interest of the party. And having a socialist become the mayor of New York City is probably not going to improve the branding of the Democratic Party.
Right.
That said, there are things to learn from Mamdani. Like,
Yeah.
It's funny what works when you talk about problems people have versus your own personal agenda. What Mamdani's talking about, to his credit, is the issues that voters care about. Hey, everything costs too much here. What can we do about it? Now, his solutions, I think, are solutions that have been tried and just don't work. But but when somebody's running a better campaign, the answer isn't just throw money at a bad candidate that is running a worse campaign.
No, and also, I don't know if this is just because the super PACs have actually like obviously made things worse, where there's a belief if I just throw this money in a super PAC and they, bombard voters with tactics, like that somehow is going to make up for not having a good message or a good candidate. Like, it doesn't. So I don't care how much money is in here, like how many robocalls you do.
Does anybody remember the Michael Bloomberg third term? Because, people seem to forget. Yes, he won.
Oh, yeah.
Remember how narrow his victory was?
Yeah.
And the candidate ran like nothing, right? Remember, it was like, and you're
they
like,
had a crazy breakdown of like the cost per voter at the time. I can't remember what it was, but it was wild.
And yes, he won, but it was, you're like, money, unless you're going to literally overwhelming money, which is ultimately what he had, but he didn't have the right message. He just did overwhelm tactically. But these days it's hard to overwhelm tactically.
No, I totally agree. And look, Mamdani, he ran a good campaign, and to your point, like sometimes, like this is really what it comes down to, like who has the better message and who runs the better campaign, and it's like that's kind of what it's all about. So,
what do you expect Cuomo to do? Is he going to drop?
I don't think so. No,
I mean, he's going to see this through, right? Because he does poll the best, right?
Yeah.
I don't think any of them can win a one-on-one with Mamdani, right? I just think that. And if Trump endorses Cuomo, I assume I don't see how that helps Cuomo.
Yeah, I don't know.
I don't see how that works as a net benefit. And so it feels like a trap to unite around Cuomo. He's the best possible version, and yet, he probably loses too.
Yeah. Well, I mean, in some respects, it's similar but different. But it's like, it's the message of, well, at least I'm not the other guy, right? And I think as we've come to find out, that is
unless the other guy is literally Roy Moore, who was a child predator.
Right.
Or David Duke, who was a white supremacist. Like, I think about the times that this has worked. Okay.
Right.
It's
worked. Very specific. It's very specific.
Is like, and unless it is so egregious, like, Edward Edwards was a crook, but it was like, vote for the crook. It's important. Right. This is the great bumper sticker. By the way, Edward Edwards was a likable guy too. Right. Like that actually, he actually had positive charisma, which I think mattered too. But, and Doug Jones was a good candidate. Right. He did so. But ultimately, this only works when it's that flawed. Other than that, it usually doesn't.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I think that's totally right. So I do feel like we know what the outcome is going to be. And I don't think throwing a bunch of money, in ad buys is going to make a difference. I think that's also misunderstanding why Mamdani is successful and how, he's built his campaign from the ground up. And, again, like it's like different tactics, different message, but this idea that you can just throw a ton of money and somehow that makes the difference, I just think is antiquated.
Look, the larger issue is this is an indictment of democratic governance of blue cities, right? And Mamdani has a different answer than Daniel Lurie has, but they're both won for the same reason.
Yeah.
Right? They met the voters where they were. That's right.
Yeah.
They met the voters where the voters were. Hard stop.
Yeah.
Well, do you like being a voter in New York City this year, or do you wish you weren't?
I mean, it keeps it interesting, right? So at least, look, half the time we don't even really make it to a competitive general election here.
That's right. He could be the first mayor since John Lindsay not to get a majority, which is interesting.
Yeah.
Here's a fun stat for you. Before Eric Adams, the three previous mayors all ran for president.
Oh,
How about that?
that is, huh.
Rudy Bloomberg and de Blasio.
I kind of always forget about de Blasio. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. You and a bunch of
I
other New
know.
Yorkers. Yeah.
I know. Well, look, I get it. As when I worked for Mayor Giuliani, we used to talk about how the government he ran was, more sizable than the
100%.
state
It
of the
is.
state of Massachusetts that Governor Romney managed. So I can see where where from a governance perspective, there's an equation there, but there is something, and I may be prone to this because I obviously I worked for a governor in New Jersey. I'm from upstate New York, not the city, but I do like the kind of rebellious character, and I like kind of a little bit of
Hmm.
the anti-establishment, which I think there's probably more Rudy than Bloomberg. But
Yeah.
I don't. Again, that becomes it's interesting because I don't know how that ultimately translates right when you get on the
Right.
national stage. It's more difficult, even though it can seem endearing or people like the idea that not sometimes it isn't where you ultimately, I guess, want to see your president, but then Trump broke that mold, so I don't know. Like,
Let
what
me
do we
get you out
know?
of here on this. How confident are you that you know who the next governor of New Jersey is? I think
Not
it's going to be the
super
closest
confident.
race. I think it's going
Yeah.
to be the closest
It's
race of
just
all the 25 races.
yeah,
Maybe the California referendum on redistricting is super close too, but
yeah,
ultimately, I think this is a nail biter, personally.
yeah. And for it to be in Alberta, New Jersey is always interesting, right?
Hmm.
And I think that's right when you look at the last election and how close it was, and just
I'd rather
um,
be Chitterelli than Cheryl in
yeah,
this
and how
political
each
environment.
yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think, there's been, sort of you're saying things Harris couldn't do, and sort of look at Cheryl. I just feel like sometimes there are uh, some certain Democrats sometimes feel too beholden to some of their special interest groups in a way that makes
So
them
true.
uncomfortable in a general to kind of break away from a messaging perspective. Which Republicans are more. I mean, when Christie ran, obviously you had to do that, right?
Well,
And sort
and
of
Republicans
our
let them, right?
yeah, so where
Like
our
they
philosophy
let
was
you.
like, yeah, like where are
Yeah.
they gonna go? Or who are they gonna
Right.
vote
And
for? Right.
Chitterelli,
So
well, Democrats, I don't know. Bill Clinton was the only one that had that attitude.
yeah.
You
Like,
know,
and there's like a
dared them to
nervousness.
bail on
Yeah.
him. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. Like then you would be happy
No,
then with the alternative. So it's
there's no doubt that the current leadership of the sort of the Democratic infrastructure is much. I always say this: the Democratic strategist community is to the left of the voters, and the Republican strategist community is also to the left of the voters. But
yeah.
that allows them to talk to swing voters,
Yes.
where the Democratic
Yes.
strategists are only talking to the base, right? Like,
Yeah.
and that's there's not enough, frankly, right of center consultants like yourself talking to the Democratic Party.
Yeah. And I think that's a really smart, great way to summarize it. I actually feel describes sort of my experience when I've been working
Hmm.
with Democrats,
Hmm.
that it sort of captures sort of when I would kind of be like, wait, what's going on here? So I think it's exactly that. Uh,
Yeah. Maria, this is great. I mean,
yeah, this is fun.
this is a lot. Like I said, I remember, I think a conversation in a coffee shop. What do you think of working for Chuck Grassley's office? I'm like, yes, go to Iowa, get to Iowa. That's where you want to be. Did you ever work for Grassley for like 10
I
seconds or
I
you didn't do
didn't.
that one? Yeah.
I didn't do. Just Iowa just was Nussel, 18 months
Yeah.
in Iowa for Nussel, and then
But I was
was at
right? A little
you were
Iowa
with
experience goes a
Iowa.
long
Yeah,
way, right?
it
Yeah.
did.
Yeah.
It did, and um, yeah. I therefore then worked for presidential candidates who did not play well at
Who
all
always
in
wanted to
Iowa.
skip Iowa.
So,
And I've
and
always
I was like,
thought, I mean, the thing is that it is ultimately, if you tell voters you don't want to talk to them, that's going to burn you down the road.
yeah. No, I
You
think
know,
that's
the
true. I do
skipping is
think
a
for
mistake. The
yeah,
skipping has always been a mistake. You don't have to compete as heavily, right? You can emphasize and say, hey, I'm here. I'm going to show up here. But, I thought McCain got it right the second time,
yeah. I
you
think you
know.
almost have to live it. Because I think sometimes it becomes hard like a candidate, and I feel like this happened with a few folks I worked for. You sort of are not going to spend a lot of time in Iowa, but then you kind of get pulled into Iowa. So then
Because there's
you're
always an
really
event, right? There's an
right,
event, and then you're like, hey, the whole national press is going to be at the state fair. Maybe I ought to go to
right.
the
So we
state
should
fair,
right.
right? Yeah.
So then you're kind of like half in, half out. So it ultimately like serves no
Right.
purpose. So yeah,
Well, and by the way, back then, both in 16 and 8, obviously it's less so today, Iowa's a swing state. That was
Right.
always where
Yeah.
I thought it was a mistake.
Totally.
Because like you're going to have to go back and talk to these voters because there's, and so that's where I've always, I'm not surprised that everybody that's tried the New Hampshire only strategy, it only worked for Clinton because everybody skipped Iowa because Tom Harkin was in the race. Like that is not everybody took the incorrect lesson from Clinton. Because if there's no Harkin, Clinton doesn't skip Iowa. Frankly, Clinton is built for Iowa. He would have probably won the caucuses without Harkin.
Yeah.
He's that kind of folksy kind of guy. So anyway, Maria, this was awesome. We're going to have to do this more often.
Yes, this was fun. Thanks for having me.